I'm Carlos Ponte from Masdar. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to share very brief introductory remarks on the topic to leave as much time as possible for our panelists to share their experiences. As you know, Masdar's objective at the moment is to reach 100 gigawatts of renewable energy projects by 2030. This is a very ambitious target that is very important to address the climate emergency. But at the same time, this brings many challenges, including challenges for the management of biodiversity. The quick-paced development of renewable energy projects, mostly in rural areas, that is where we have the right solar resource and wind resource, means that we very often affect natural habitats and threatened species. We consider biodiversity very early on in project development to avoid biodiversity impacts when possible. But when this is not possible, we mitigate and offset impacts to ensure that we have a net biodiversity gain on each of our projects. In this context, it's very important for us to understand what are the latest methodologies and approaches. And we are very happy to be here today with such a strong panel of experts that we will learn from to make sure that we are up to date on the latest developments. And I will pass it on to Huda to give her remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos, for the introduction, and thank you also to Masdar for their support and partnership on hosting our Hiwar today as part of ADSW web series for 2023. It's also my great pleasure to address you on a topic of immense importance, the path towards a nature-positive future. I would like to share my screen. Okay, so thank you again. And my name is Huda Al-Haqani, Director Abu Dhabi Sustainability Group at Environment Agency Abu Dhabi. And as we all know, that world faces a significant challenge in preserving our natural resources and ecosystem. Our planet, ecosystems, and biodiversity are under severe threat, and it is essential that we take immediate and urgent steps to address this crisis. Abu Dhabi Sustainability Group is an affiliation and partnership initiative established by the Environment Agency Abu Dhabi to promote sustainability management and foster collaboration and implementation of enhanced sustainable business practices in Abu Dhabi by providing learning and knowledge sharing opportunities for all. And our Hiwar is one of our key platforms to drive our mission to accelerate knowledge mobilization and empower various sectors in Abu Dhabi to engage and support the delivery of Abu Dhabi and UAE sustainability visions and support its efforts to combat climate change and promote sustainable development. And I believe this meeting is an opportunity for us to come together and share our experience, as well explore ways to work together towards a common visions. The next few years, government, business, investors, and communities need to move towards a more environmentally conscious level of operating, so economics function to not only stabilize damage to our ecosystem, but also work to enhance and accelerate their recovery. The good news that we have the knowledge and tools to create a nature positive future, and it is within our reach to achieve it. The ongoing COP15 biodiversity agreement negotiation provide a unique opportunity for us to chart a new course towards a sustainable future. Climate change and biodiversity loss are closely linked, and addressing both issues requires a coordinated effort. A nature-positive future is therefore an essential part of our response to climate change. The session agenda will cover the key impacts of global biodiversity addressed in COP15 Biodiversity Summit in Montreal, and how we can contribute practically to delivering to these goals and targets at local level by learning from both local and regional leaders. And without further ado, now I would like to handing you over to our panel moderator, Cedric Bachellery, Managing Director at Sustainamics, to introduce our distinguished speakers and start the session. Over to you, Cedric. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Huda. Greetings from the United Arab Emirates and welcome to all to this HIWAR session on the path towards a nature positive future with Abu Dhabi Sustainability Group and hosted by Masdar. HIWAR means dialogue, and it's very much our intention to engage all of you in the dialogue with our guests. You are 600 to have registered to this event to join us online, so that's quite a large crowd to have a dialogue with. And we are not sitting in the same room, but that doesn't prevent us from leading this dialogue in a modern way using technology. So we are very accustomed to chatting and asking our questions via text. I can see already lots of people engaging on the chat box. We are encouraging you to do that throughout the panel, but to use the Q&A box to ask your questions or make your comments addressed to the panelists. So the Q&A box, not the chat box, the Q&A box, please. And we'll make all efforts to use your questions and suggestions in our dialogue with the experts. And it's very tempting to kick off a panel on nature positive with a very philosophical or poetic reflection on the eternal relationship between humans and nature, and how humans are both in nature and constantly fighting it to control it. The fact is, it's Mother Earth who every day feeds me, every day clothes me, and cures me when I feel I'm in bad health, including bad mental health. So when you know your mother is hurt, you want to act fast. And so instead of philosophical or poetic reflections on our relationship with nature, I think we owe it to our generation and our children's generation to be very practical and focused on action. The emergency we are faced with requires us to provide clarity, credibility, and inspiration, because we need to be able to halt and reverse the biodiversity decline that is currently happening under our watch due to our human activities. Our panelists are the right group of experts to help us do exactly that. They've had front seats, some metaphorically, some real front seats to the historical United Nations Kunming Montreal Agreement last December at COP15. That so 188 governments agree that we should all become nature positive and setting targets for as early as 2030. That is in only 7 years. So first, let me introduce you to Martin Lok. After a career in the Dutch Ministries of Agriculture and of Economic Affairs, Martin is now the Executive Director at the Capitals Coalition. Martin was also an amateur literary critic for several years. So Martin, what's your favorite book?
So That's an interesting question, Cedric, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Thank you very much for having me here. So many good books, but the one springing into my mind immediately, and on the top list, one of the top three, would be Il Gattopardo from Tomasi di Lampedusa. So it's an Italian novel. I read it in Dutch, to be honest. The Leopard, it's called in English. And one of the reasons why I really love this book, it's about the unification in Italy. Garibaldi traveling to Sicily, and then how does a nation change? And one of my favorite quotes is, it's the nephew of a prince. The prince doesn't want to change because, well, he is a prince, so you can imagine why he doesn't want to change. And his nephew says to him, if we want to keep everything the same, everything must change. And I use this quote a lot, and I think it's also very valid for today's discussion.
Great, Martin. We'll come back to you in a minute. Let me introduce our other panelists. Next, let me introduce Dexter Galvin, a veteran of CDP, the Global Environmental Reporting System, where Dexter is now the Global Director for Corporations and Supply Chains. If many more organizations today are making Scope 3 commitments, that's a lot thanks to Dexter's spearheading of CDP's supply chain program since 2008. This Dexter, for one, could actually lecture us on the internal relationship between humans and nature, because he was actually trained in philosophy and history at the Trinity College Dublin. But I think if you ask him, he'll prefer to lecture us on the role model corporations who are today creating measurable positive impact for the planet. Do you confirm, Dexter?
Absolutely. I think the corporate world has a massive role to play in this, and we're only going to solve it by working closely with the private sector. CDP has a fantastic model where we leverage the power of investors and buyers to drive corporate action on these topics. And I think you need a bit of carrot and a bit of stick. So it's all well and good to say it's wonderful to save the planet, but we also need to incentivize organizations to take action. And that's the model that we built up at CDP.
Wonderful. Thank you. Welcome. Welcome, Dexter. Next, allow me to introduce you to Marina Antonopoulou. Marina is Director, Nature, Conservation and Climate at the Emirates Nature WWF here in the UAE. Marina is a trained environmental scientist who's authored several publications on the topic, many related to the UAE ecosystems. Marina has worked on conservation and environmental policies for 18 years, and she's keen in advancing stakeholder dialogue on nature and climate. She's also a board member at the UAE Beekeepers Association. Marina, how are the bees doing in the UAE? Are they all right?
It's a good question. I think bees are not doing very well globally, but also here in the UAE, they're facing some additional conditions. We have some, if you like, invasive species that they have proliferated in this part of the world. So the work of Beekeepers Association specifically is to enhance the local populations, but also work with beekeepers on sustainable practices, which is also very closely related to what we do at Emirates Nature WWF. So working with communities, private sector and government to find solutions to address the societal challenges we're facing today, both on nature, climate change and economics. So thank you very much for the introduction, Cedric. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Welcome, Marina. And finally, our fourth speaker, Shargil Bashir, EVP and Chief Sustainability Officer at First Abu Dhabi Bank, the largest bank in the UAE, recently identified by LinkedIn as one of the top 10 experts worth following in the MENA region for all matters related to sustainability. And I believe a fan of cricket, but the sport, not the insect. Am I correct?
That is correct, Cedric. I can't say there's too much nature positive about the sports cricket though. But yeah, I watch cricket when I have the time, even though it's a pretty long game to watch.
Excellent. Welcome to all four of you. So we are together for 90 minutes until 3:30 p.m. UAE time. Our agenda, as you know, is that each expert will share his or her perspective on the topic for 7 to 8 minutes. Then we'll start to engage them in a discussion using your questions as prompts for 20-25 minutes. So please don't hesitate to start questioning them using the Q&A chat box. And lastly, I'll attempt to draw a short summary on the main emerging ideas before handing over to Huda. We'll come back to close the session. Okay, let's get cracking. Martin, let's start with you. Please tell us what happened last December in Montreal during this COP15. Why was this meeting so significant for us? And what role did the Capitals Coalition play during this historical event?
Thank you very much, Cedric. And I was trying to share my screen with you, but it's the wrong presentation that's popping up. That's what I said when we were testing out. You try it, and then when you start again, it's not working at all. So apologies for that. I will try it a couple of times again, and it will get on. But let me start talking also about what happened in Montreal, because it was a really changing event. And it was new because for the first time, there were not only negotiators from governments around the table, and there were many in Montreal, in total 14,000 people discussing all about the new nature policy that is needed to help reverse nature loss. But also there were many business representatives. So 14,000 in total, 10,000 of those were from the private sector. And we collaborated with Business for Nature, a business coalition, as well as many other partners, including WWF, also here around the table. And we as a coalition, we brought 700 business and finance representatives to Montreal to advocate for ambitious policies. So let me try again to share the proper screen. Now it is on. That's good. Let me first briefly introduce who I am and my organization. I'm the executive director of the Capitals Coalition, and we sit at the heart of a global network that really comes together to advance value accounting. What we mean by that, we want to include the value of nature and people into decision making. You see here also, it is more than 400 organizations, more than 25,000 people coming together. We have hubs in several countries, including in the Emirates, and we have produced two protocols, a natural capital protocol and a social and human capital protocol that help business and finance to understand their impacts and dependencies on nature as well as on people. And we are working on an integrated protocol right now. And why are all these people coming together in our organization, in our coalition? That is because we see there's a big challenge. The world is not successfully addressing global challenges like nature loss, climate change, as well as rising inequality. And the underlying reason for this is we are not recognizing the value of nature and people into our decision-making processes. So the solution is to change this. And our ambition is that by 2030, the majority of business, finance, and governments is including those values. And the Kunming Montreal Agreement and the negotiations running up to it was clearly making it clear that for nature, when we talk about natural capital, this is an urgent issue to address. This is a picture from the Dasgupta review, a review commissioned by the Treasury in the UK, and this really gets it in one picture, I think. The business, the economy is embedded within nature. It's not a nice to have nature. If there's no nature, business cannot produce its products and its services, and economies cannot thrive. And also the national economies will not thrive. So that's what we need to keep in mind. And this, from the same publication, shows how produced capital is developing, how human capital is developing, and how natural capital is developing. And you see it here quite clearly. Globally, the economy thrives, is going in the right direction, but at the expense of nature. And of course, the key question is, can this continue? No, it cannot. So that was the main problem on the table for the negotiators at COP15. And at that meeting, the UN concluded the negotiations on a new plan to address the nature crisis by 2030. This is called the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. So if you hear this, this is what it's all about. And I already mentioned, we brought 700 private sector representatives to the negotiations. That is a clear indication that it is a business relevant issue. They wouldn't travel to Kunming or to Montreal. And by the way, it was in Montreal because of the COVID situation in China, but they wouldn't travel there if it's not a clear business issue to them. So I will introduce what is in the agreement, but also highlight why it is so relevant for business. So this is a complicated picture. Sorry about this. But the text of the Global Biodiversity Framework, these are the elements which are in there. So there's a 2050 long-term vision, living in harmony with nature. There are 4 specific goals focusing on nature conservation, ecosystem services, preservation. So the services from nature, like having clean water, access and benefit sharing to the resources that nature provides needs to be equitable around the world, and financing and the means of implementation. A key element was the agreement to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. That's a mission. And that's a very important element because it established a global goal for nature. Climate change had 1.5 degrees and 0 carbon. Nature was more complicated. Now it has this mission, and it gives a clear objective for businesses that they also can rally behind. And then there are 23 targets with different elements in that. First on the goals, another remark. Goal D includes an agreement that financial flows need to be aligned. This is similar as in climate change, and it has proven in climate change to be very effective. So that's also part of it. Focusing on 23 targets, are they all relevant for business? Well, most of them are, but some stand out. So there are targets around reducing threats, protecting 30% of land, inland waters, and the oceans, setting aside for nature protection, of course, affects businesses. How is the interaction there? Reducing pollution to a level not harmful to biodiversity, including 50% reduction of risk of pesticides, clear business relation, as well as is the case for minimizing the impact of businesses. Moving to sustainable use, there's also target 9, which really focuses on managing and use species in a sustainable way. So target 10 focuses a little bit more on agriculture. So that's what that's all about. And this new agreement sets out the requirements for that. And then target 13, which is specifically on access and benefit sharing and making the use of nature and its resources more equitable around the world. And then coming to implementation and mainstreaming, these are the key bits for business. Target 15, target 18, the most important, where we advocate for. Target 15, with the 700 people, we advocated for mandatory requirements for large businesses as well as financial institutions to assess and disclose their risk, impacts, and dependencies. And this was agreed. The word mandatory is not into the final text, but in effect, if you see what has been agreed, businesses will be expected to assess and disclose their impacts and dependencies on nature, and also to reduce negative impacts and increase positive impacts, in line with the mission to halt and reverse biodiversity loss by 2030. This is a very clear message for business. Target 18 focuses on the subsidies, the incentives that are in place. There are many incentives in government subsidies that point in the wrong direction. 1.8 trillion US dollars a year is spent by governments around the world in subsidies that are harmful for nature. So that's not helpful if you want to reverse this. So reforming that, eliminating, phasing out harmful subsidies is a clear target, and business also has to play a role here. Linked to this is the ambition to scale up positive incentives for conservation, which of course will also be a very great help here. So what's next? The framework is adopted, and now it will be translated into national policies, laws, and regulations. So governments have 2 years, the time now, to update their national biodiversity strategy and action plans, including the national targets by COP16. So in 2 years' time, 2024. And these plans will detail how governments are planning to implement to achieve all its the mission and the targets, including what business needs to do. So what can business already do? And one thing which really I think came out of many of the businesses in Montreal, what they more or less said to the negotiators was, whatever you will decide, we will go and implement the key things for us anyway. So yes, we will start to assess and impact our dependencies. And I think this was a very powerful message. Many negotiators came to the business delegations and said, wow, you're more ambitious than many of the governments, which indeed was true. So companies will need to take urgent actions on nature. And what you see here is the framing that we, together with Business for Nature, with the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, with WWF and with the World Economic Forum and a couple of others, have published last year in Davos. This is a aligned version of what do business need to do. They have to assess their impacts and dependencies. They have to commit to setting science-based targets, and they have to transform their activities and then avoid and reduce negative impacts. And there's a lot of guidance available for businesses already. So I just pop up 3 major ones. There are the protocols that we have been developing. TNFD is already quite on their way to publish guidance on how to disclose impacts and dependencies on nature. And by the way, the TNFD guidance builds on the structure of the Nature Capital Protocol. And Science Based Targets Network will publish their guidance for setting science-based targets in March. So a lot of the guidance is available. Yes, there's more. Yes, it will be improved over the next couple of years, and it will align further and further. But there is already a lot available.
Thank you, Martin. It's really clear. So I think my question now is, let's suppose I'm not one of these 700 companies that went to Montreal. On the contrary, I'm quite worried about the changes of my business model that this commitment of my government may lead me to adopt. So what can I do? Because 2030 is very, very soon. I'm amazed by the sense of urgency that these targets are creating. So what should I do now immediately? Where can I start? You have this model, you have these booklets. What should I start to do today or tomorrow to be ready for 2030?
Yes, so I think 2 things. First of all, when you get these slides, you will see that the high-level business actions on nature is clickable, so you can click on it, and you will get to a website where you find all the detailed guidance documents that are available. So that's an easy way to get on board. One of those would be a link to an online course that you can take to understand more about what is needed. And many businesses already are working on this. I think the second thing is to reach out to the business organization in your own country and to urge them to have a conversation with the government on what they are going to do around their update of the NBCEP, so the national plans, and how are they going to include business. So we, together with Business for Nature, are kind of hammering on the doors of the national negotiators to continue the conversation with business at the national level. Now the implementation phase is there. So I think those two things are there for business already to act upon. And for this, the deadline is not 2030. The governments need to have their plans ready by 2024. So that's next year.
Well, so NBSAP, that's an acronym I need to learn now, which is the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plan. Is that correct?
That is correct. So you go to the next round, Cedric.
Excellent. Thank you. Well, so do you, Martin. Thank you for your very clear presentation. Now I'd like to ask Dexter to be our next panelist. And Dexter, we've talked about nature without defining it. And I wonder how will I know whether my company is nature positive or nature negative? Is there a standard way for business to measure its healthy relationship with nature? Can you help us with that?
Well, thank you so much, Cedric, and thank you, Huda and Carlos, for hosting this wonderful discussion. I'm just going to start sharing my screen in the meanwhile, but it's fabulous to see so many different organizations and different parts of the world represented in this discussion today. So I'm going to take you through a brief background to CDP. Then I'm going to talk to you about how we can potentially use the CDP mechanism to solve some of this problem. So you saw Martin's presentation there, and the final slide, which he left up on the screen for a little bit, showed disclose, disclose, disclose around the edge of the circle, which is absolutely the first step. And CDP was founded as the Carbon Disclosure Project in the early 2000s. So disclosure is literally our middle name. So excited to talk to you a little bit about that and how disclosure can help companies on the journey to taking action on this topic. So a little bit of context. Of course, we know that this is a significant challenge. Climate change is already happening. It's impacting people all over the world right now. Where climate change is the shark, then water is the teeth, where the impacts of climate change will be felt most acutely. So we have significant work to do on water and water security. Deforestation is a huge problem. So I don't want to labor too much on this. We've lost masses of wildlife. We all know the scale of the problem. So we need to start talking about solutions and how we get into this solution focus. So CDP is an environmental not-for-profit. We're built around the concept of disclosure, as I mentioned before. Our theory of change is that the information that we collect is a fundamental basis for action. The economy looks to us as the gold standard on carbon reporting, now also on water security reporting and on deforestation data. And our plan is always to mainstream this mechanism, this disclosure mechanism, to make sure that we can drive a climate safe, water secure, deforestation free world. So CDP is built around a very simple concept. Actually, in the early 2000s, our founder went around to the major financial institutions in London and asked them to sign a letter to large listed corporations to disclose their impact on climate change. So whether they would disclose their data on climate change. And actually, the challenge at the time was that the big banks and pension funds didn't want to sign a letter that explicitly acknowledged the issue of climate change. So we had to say because of the perceived threat of climate change. So we've used the power of the investors to drive large listed companies to disclose data on climate change over the past 2 decades. We then expanded into water security and into deforestation. And of course, as we expanded into those other areas, looking at water and deforestation in particular, these are areas of nature. And as we look to our 2025 strategy, we're looking at more and more areas of nature disclosure. So the next step has been biodiversity. We integrated biodiversity into the questionnaires last year, and I have some data that I can share with you on that. And we are now in the process of introducing plastics. The next step will be oceans and marine life and waste more broadly. So we've had some considerable success over the years. We now represent over 680 institutional signatory investors with 130 trillion of assets under management, which means basically we represent over half of the world's invested capital. So it's quite a significant stick when we ask a large listed corporation to disclose on these topics. It's basically saying your owners, your investors want you to take action on this issue. In about 2006, we were working with Walmart for many years, getting them to disclose on climate change. And they said to us, in fact, the vast majority of our impact is in our supply chain. Can we use that questionnaire that you've sent us on behalf of our investors to engage our supply chains? And that was the start of the program that I run, the supply chain program. And I joined when we were kicking it off with Walmart. And now we represent over, and these are numbers from last year, we have over 350 global supply chain organizations with about 7 trillion of annual procurement spend engaging their suppliers. And that also includes the US federal government, who have made CDP disclosure effectively mandatory for contracts of over $50 million. So in all, we carry rather a big stick to get companies to disclose this data. And that has driven some success. So if we look at this graph, we can see our growth in climate change disclosure. So about 18,600 companies disclose the very detailed CDP disclosure on climate change. And then if we look in the other topics, the more nature-related topics, water security, we had about 3,000 disclosures last year, and deforestation, we had about 1,000. We look at deforestation through a commodity lens. So we look at commodity-driven deforestation caused by timber, cattle, soy, and palm. We also have some elements of rubber in there as well. So you can look at the degradation that those commodities are causing in the supply chains of major corporations. And what's very interesting about this is 11.4 times the average company's emissions are actually in their supply chain. For water security is almost entirely a supply chain issue, and deforestation is in itself a supply chain issue for most of the organizations that are disclosing to us. So there's a huge amount of work to be done to manage this information in the supply chain. CDP is all around the world. We've got offices all around the world supporting responding companies and helping organizations understand the importance of these various topics. And also in the Middle East, we have 29 companies responding in 2022 and 5 responding to the CDP's water security questionnaire. However, we are planning a very significant expansion of our work in the region this year. So we'll be asking over 400 of the largest companies in the region to disclose to our investor request. That means that 130 trillion of assets under management will be asking the largest listed corporations in your region to address these topics. So that's going to be a huge change in the level of pressure. We also have, of course, the supply chain organizations that will be expanding their lists into the Middle East. So we have a lot of work to do to build up capabilities in the region. Now, disclosure, it's a journey, right? So the key thing is that we start on this journey. The data on climate change has become incredibly sophisticated. And you've seen from Martin's presentation that a lot of these issues are becoming law. Government have made this commitment in 2030. We will expect to see some sort of mandatory disclosure regime come into play in the future. And that's how these things work. if you look at climate change, for example, a lot of the metrics that we have been asking companies to disclose on over the last 2 decades have become law in most jurisdictions. So the SEC cited CDP 40 times in their ruling on climate disclosure, and those metrics that we have collected will now be law. And so you can imagine the same will happen on water security, on deforestation, and most particularly for this discussion on biodiversity. Now, we asked companies last year for the first time on biodiversity. 87% actually responded to the biodiversity question, which is fabulous. However, 70% of those said that they did not assess the impact of biodiversity on their value chains. And if we look into the other topics like water, only 23% of responding organizations are engaging their supply chain on water. And we are in the midst of a terrible water security crisis, which is going to get a lot worse over the coming years, which has masses of impact on all areas of biodiversity. So what we at CDP recognize is the essential symbiosis of all of these topics. And the great thing is we're bringing investor capital and procurement power to bear to support organizations to take action on this topic. Because the CDP questionnaire, it's not just a questionnaire gathering data, it's a framework for taking action on these topics. So you start on your journey and start understanding how you should calculate the impacts of these issues, and gathering the data, building the governance structure, understanding your risks. That's what disclosure is all about. So as you in the region, in the Middle East, start on your disclosure journey, it's one of the most effective ways to really address these issues of biodiversity, water, deforestation, and climate, all essentially symbiotic.
And Dexter, the 20 years that CDP exists, do you want to single out maybe one environmental leader who's been with you for a long time and who's now maybe a role model for how other businesses should use your questionnaire and your tool?
Well, I'll single out two. There's two 2030 commitments that I really appreciate, which is the Unilever commitment of 2030, which looks at all of the topics and kind of recognizes their essential symbiosis. I also appreciate very much the L'Oreal 2030 goals, which looks at land use. So one of the things that L'Oreal will be doing is getting rid of basically moving all packaging to bio-based packaging, which will obviously have a massive impact on land use. But their commitment says that they will keep the same land use footprint that they have today whilst doubling their business and moving all of their packaging to bio-based. So that is quite a significant shift. And I like the fact that they've put land use and land preservation alongside the commitments in the other areas. And that's what we'll see much more of over the coming years, is people realizing, okay, I've got this very ambitious science-based target to reduce my emissions, but that means nothing if I don't address water security issues or deforestation. So that symbiosis is becoming more clearly recognized across the business system, and investors are upskilling significantly on it as well, I think.
Great. Thank you, Dexter. And so Unilever, L'Oreal, have a look at their annual reports, sustainability reports, to understand what they're doing a little bit more. Marina, I'd like to call Marina next. Marina, the text of the global biodiversity framework signed in December used a lot of terms like risks, dependencies, impacts. Can you help us understand what they mean, but also using concrete examples of what's happening in the UAE? Maybe that will help us.
Sure. Thank you, Cendric. And also I'd like to thank the organizers, Masdar, the ADSW as well for hosting us, as well as the Abu Dhabi Sustainability Group. I just want to also quickly introduce the organization I'm working with. So Emirates Nature WWF. So we are a local nonprofit environmental organization based here in the UAE. We have been active for about 22 years when we also work in association with the Worldwide Fund for Nature. Some of you are aware of it. It's one of the largest global NGOs present in 100 countries around the world. Similar to Martin's presentation, our mandate essentially for the UAE is to create a future where people and nature live in harmony. Our mandate is to advance the sustainability agenda locally in the UAE, both on climate change and biodiversity action. And as I mentioned earlier, we cannot do that alone. For all of our projects, we partner with both government and private entities. We partner with local communities. Let's not forget the local communities and the small-scale businesses, as well as academia and research institutions, because they have a key role to play if we are to actually integrate biodiversity into our decision-making, as well as ourselves. I'm just trying to pass to the next slide. Here is just a snapshot of the work we have been doing in the past 20 years, ranging from awareness campaigns for public, contributing to national plans and strategies from climate change and biodiversity, but also working on the ground to protect nature together with the local communities, both inland and in the ocean. And I think just kind of reflecting on what we've heard earlier, it's really important to integrate biodiversity into our decision-making, both for governments, but also for businesses. But it's quite challenging oftentimes because nature, as the Dasgupta review report that Martin also referenced earlier, has identified 3 pervasive features of nature. So ecosystems are typically silent. We don't really hear from them how well they're doing or what is their status in terms of health. They're invisible. A lot of the times is very relevant, obviously, for ocean ecosystems. We can't really see them. They're out of sight, so we don't really appreciate the services that they provide to our economies and our communities. But also a lot of biophysical processes are happening, underground in the soil. So often we tend to underestimate and not also understand or having the scientific knowledge to understand those processes. And nature is quite mobile. So a lot of species are migratory. They straddle across jurisdictions, and often it's very difficult to devise the right strategies at the right scale to address the biodiversity loss that we need. And these are some of the challenges we're facing to understand the impact that we're having on nature, but also understanding this dual materiality that we spoke earlier, essentially how our impact is influencing the negatively or positively those natural capital flows, the natural resources businesses relying on, essentially back to their economic growth and business models. And similarly to what was presented earlier, also WWF, of course, is a partner to the Natural Capital Coalition and to the Task Force of Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. We would like to see those frameworks being adopted more and more in the region. There is also recent reports for businesses in terms of how to integrate biodiversity risks. And I would also like to point to the Sustainable Blue Economy Principles that, again, WWF with a number of other international entities developed and now is hosted under the UNEP Finance Initiative, which aims to essentially advise investors and financial institutions. We haven't spoken so much about it. Sure, Gil will give us a bit of flavor, but this is essentially what WWF is also wants to contribute to the dialogue and advise. But essentially, when it comes to the local level, I think nature and biodiversity, of course, we see in the global frameworks, but often for decision, we rely on local data or regional information and regional decisions. So here I'd just like to give a snapshot of one of our flagship projects we've been implementing for the past couple of years, which focuses on nature-based solutions. We're focusing on coastal ecosystems here in the UAE, and the goal is essentially to advance the conservation and restoration of those coastal ecosystems on the ground. And because those ecosystems are also sequestering CO2 from the atmosphere into the roots, back into the soil, they play a key role for climate change mitigation. So we want to measure what the success looks like and how do we contribute to the broader climate change mitigation and adaptation. Of course, as we heard earlier, there is a number of socioeconomic benefits deriving from nature. So we want to look at how do we enhance and identify those benefits for small-scale enterprises and entrepreneurs already operating in those areas, and looking into the right partnerships to unlock the financing we need for nature-based solutions to be scaled up in the future. And just to mention that this project is part of a global initiative implemented by WWF and the World Resource Institute and financed by a philanthropic grant from HSBC. There are numerous projects similar to ours implemented around the world, and the aim is to scale up and pilot this type of nature-based solutions and share the lessons learned to the rest of the world as well and the community. And just as I mentioned earlier, we mapped out the coastal habitats that are very prominent in the UAE. It's not only about mangroves, it's all about the different habitats that they coexist. And we mapped out 5 important ecosystem services that those habitats essentially offer us: carbon storage, as I mentioned earlier, coastal protection from sea level rise and erosion, biodiversity, of course, opportunities for ecotourism and fisheries. And based on those 5 ecosystem services, we developed a framework to offer us and help us to select our sites. Together with our stakeholders, we selected 2 coastal lagoons, or HORs, as we call it here, one in Abu Dhabi and one in Al Quwain. And just to quickly mention that, again, this is a collaboration. We have been working with the Ministry of Climate Change and Environment, but of course, on the ground, Environment Agency of Abu Dhabi and Government of Al Quwain are quite key partners of ours. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, academia, research institutions are key collaborators of ours. So you see a number of institutions locally and globally who are offering their expertise to this project. So just to dive into what we've been doing this last couple of years, essentially we have been trying to map the natural capital of those coastal lagoons, so ranging from the left side to coastal habitats and biodiversity, to important areas for commercially important fish species, so important for the fisheries communities in this part of the world, but also doing blue carbon surveys and looking at what is essentially the storage that those ecosystems have been doing for the past few decades and stored underground. And lastly, to the right is that coastal protection attributed to those habitats against climate change. So what we're doing at the moment with the expert teams is essentially we're overlaying all this biophysical information with additional data on the socioeconomic side that we've been gathering. And we're going to be using the INVEST methodology. This is an open resource for everyone to use. Essentially, we're going to model all this information and identifying the value of those ecosystem services, but in a spatial configuration. And we see that as a very important tool for decision makers to use locally to look at how they're relying on the different ecosystems in nature and how they can attribute to the different benefits, economic benefits they're deriving from those, but also look at different scenarios, how climate change can affect those ecosystem services, how, for example, business as usual can also affect those ecosystem services versus conservation and informed management. Just to mention that in parallel, we have also been engaging and consulting with the local communities that I mentioned earlier. And you'll see here on the left-hand side that those community leaders and business, actually enterprises have recognized that the health of those coastal ecosystems are quite important for their well-being. Oops, sorry. And here, essentially what we're trying to do is with those local communities and businesses, we're trying to map out what are the current, but also additional socioeconomic opportunities that we can help working with them, put together some business cases that can put forward for additional financing and contributing to more commercial value, but always embedded into sustainability and essentially bringing back to the natural management, integrated management of that area. So nothing works in isolation, essentially. So businesses can benefit from nature, but they have to give back as well. And lastly, I just kind of close with this slide just to show that COP28, of course, is ahead of us in the UAE. We've seen that the COP28 presidency and the high-level champion announced that nature and climate is one of the key priorities for those discussions ahead of us. So we're very keen to participate in those global conversations, showcasing the value of coastal lagoons when it comes to climate and nature, but also seek those partnerships that, as I mentioned earlier, that we need to increase and scale up financing for those nature-based solutions. Also, of course, providing the information and the scientific data to the community here so we can see the work that we're doing, also inspiring the work of others and inform decision makers. So I'll stop here.
Wonderful. Thank you. Don't hesitate to post your questions on the Q&A. folks, as we are entering now the final round of presentations from our panels. So now I'd like to ask Shargil to share the stage and to maybe comment on the figure that Martin shared with us, that there's more than 1,000 companies who actually signed the call to action of Business for Nature to push governments to adopt the global biodiversity framework. So it must be that this global biodiversity framework is a desirable outcome for business, and we start to see some examples with Marina. So for a financial institution like FAB, where do you see the key opportunities, but also I suppose some key challenges to support and finance a green and nature positive future, Shargil?
No, thank you very much, Cedric, for the question, and thank you first of all for Master and ADSG for arranging this session. I think there are so many opportunities when we are discussing nature positive, and we need to make sure that we look at nature positive as an opportunity and not as a challenge and only something that is being done for compliance. I will come back to what kind of influence it have, and in this presentation, I would just like to go through what role the financial institutions can play into becoming nature positive, and what are the frameworks and the direction that can be used to come to this point. And then I will also address this question through the presentation as well. First of all, I think that the banks can play an extremely important role in supporting the nature positive growth. And the reason being that financial institutions has multiple touch points across many different stakeholders, many different industries, but also different kind of customers as well, whether it is large corporates, whether it is institutions, whether it is regulators, whether it's consumers. So you have so many touch points where you can influence to focus towards a nature positive growth as well. Some of the key things that financial institutions can play a key role in is, of course, to finance green projects that are supporting biodiversity, that is supporting nature positive is the obvious one, but we can also encourage on the focus on biodiversity and focus on nature. We can do this through our engagement with our clients. We can do this in engagement with our other stakeholders, whether being the regulators, policymakers, or other institutions as part of the society. But we can also, from an investment point of view, when we see financial institutions do investments, we can put the focus around sustainability, around biodiversity, and see that what is the impact of the investments that we are making as financial institutions have on biodiversity is extremely important. Then risk management is a key pillar for our financial institutions, and it's becoming more and more evident that climate change, biodiversity plays an extremely important point. In the presentation we saw just before from the CDP perspective as well, it is a very important aspect of the whole foundation of the risk management and the foundation for financial institutions as well. And finally, advocacy, as I mentioned, it's important for the financial institutions and the sector to take that ownership and responsibility to support the policymakers, to make the advocacy around enhancing the focus on nature positive growth, but also around biodiversity as well. So if you look into what banks can do actively themselves, and this is a journey that we have started at FAB as well, is first of all to analyze what is your current impact on the environment and its society, but also from a biodiversity perspective. And this is a journey that a lot of the financial institutions have taken in the past couple of years, mainly from a climate perspective, and say, you as an organization, what impact do you have on climate? Now we need to move that discussions towards biodiversity as well. So what kind of impact do you have through your lending book towards biodiversity? When you're financing an asset, that asset, what impact does that create on biodiversity and our nature is something that we need to look into. We need to start developing policies internally that does put focus on biodiversity, water scarcity, around climate. How can we support from that perspective? We need to set specific targets. We need to set targets on how we will support this specifically. One thing is that we set the baseline and understand what impact we are creating. We develop the relevant policies, but we also need to set specific targets that what is it, the change that we want to make. We also need to look into innovation. I think innovation is extremely important. This can be innovation for what the organization and the banks can do themselves, but it's also innovation on products, how we can support our clients on this journey on biodiversity. As I mentioned previously, we have touch points with so many hundreds and thousands and millions of customers. So how can we innovate solutions that can support biodiversity, can support nature on this? And finally, engagement with clients is extremely important. This is a place where we can utilize our voice, our expertise to share this information with them and make them aware of the opportunities there are within biodiversity and nature. But I also think it's extremely important that we don't only focus on nature as a risk, and I believe it's the same case for climate. We need to look at it as a business opportunity. So right now, just sharing a couple of facts here. The estimated economic value to be created by renewable natural assets is believed to be somewhere between 125 to 140 trillion. Of this, what the financing is needed is somewhere between 140 to 440 billion. So basically, so little is required to create that much of value. And this is where we all need to play an extremely important part. We can do this as a financial sector that can go together. We collaborate with multiple different stakeholders, policymakers, and etc. There are so many opportunities to unlock the potential that is out there. If we look at this number, these numbers are so big that most of us cannot relate to this. But if we then move it over to job creation, if you look at these numbers can create more than 300 million jobs. If we look into the business opportunity that is being created by focusing on nature instead of only looking on it from a risk perspective. So we need to mobilize more capital. We need to mobilize more investments towards nature. And I do believe that climate and nature, the nexus Marina was speaking about as well, which is unfocused from COP28, this nexus between nature and climate, this nexus is probably going to require the biggest capital reallocation we have probably seen ever. So this is what is required, and this is going to be one of the key challenges for the current and coming generations to make this reallocation of capital from a lot of the different investment that has been made historically to move them towards climate-friendly and nature-friendly investments that are required for the future. If you look into what banks also need to look into and financial institutions is to see the risk that is being created if they don't put focus on nature specifically. We know that nature can play a key role from a risk perspective. We have seen last year was probably one of the worst years from a climate perspective. We are also seeing from a nature perspective, when we look at the losses that nature has faced over the past decade, it's amazing and amazing that we are not taking action on these things before now. We now finally have the GBF that can support us. We have some very concrete targets, but we need to address these challenges because these will continue if we don't address these specific challenges this creates. So we have the challenge that can impact directly the banks. It will impact our clients on their businesses, which will then create a negative spiral through the different impacts and the different sectors. I also just, before I end, just want to showcase a couple of examples of how we can utilize financial products to support nature. We've seen the very good example of the Belize Blue Bond, which is basically the world's largest refinancing for ocean conservation, which reduced Belize's debt by 12% of GDP. We've also seen in the US a green bond being issued for working forests, which was 150 million green bond specifically to protect the forests of America. We've also started to see now, which was the first sovereign debt bond that was linked to KPI specifically to protect nature. This was issued, I believe, back in 2020 for Pakistan specifically, around 1 billion. We've started to see blended finance, where we have seen the African Agriculture, Trade and Investment Fund specifically. We are also seeing one of the more, what are now becoming a more normal kind of instruments, which is the sustainability linked debts, where you basically link the debt to specific performances and linking it to the sustainability related factors. So we do have the instruments in place to support on the change of nature, to support the climate nature nexus. We just need to make sure that we start utilizing these instruments. We need to make sure that organizations start defining these specific challenges and then address these challenges to the different instruments that exist already. Finally, as a conclusion, what is it that is required to achieve a nature positive future? From my perspective, I think Marina put it very well. We need the nexus between climate and nature. We cannot look at climate and nature as separate things. We need to start linking them together. We are probably right now where the climate discussion was 5-8 years ago towards where biodiversity stands today. We need to link these two much more together. We need to ensure that we raise awareness, and this is a responsibility for all of us as individuals, but also as organizations. We need to make sure that we have the right policy and regulation. We need to have the policy and regulation much more aligned. We cannot afford to spending too much time on not getting the policy and regulation right. We need to ensure that the right focus is provided on the topic of biodiversity. And finally, we need the financing. We need to mobilize the financial sector. We need to mobilize the governments in supporting the nature on the specific solutions that are required. And then I'll head back to you, Cedric.
Thank you, Shargil. And maybe we will use your closing slide to help lead us to the Q&A session, because I see already there are some questions on the link between the global biodiversity framework being nature positive and the trend towards ESG, and in particular disclosing ESG criteria, especially here in the UAE, where I think the GCC countries have aligned and agreed on a set of ESG criteria. So, Shargil, would you like to enlighten us a little bit about where you see the global biodiversity framework, the COP15 targets fitting within the existing ESG criteria framework of the GCC countries and the UAE?
Sure, happy to. So I think what was achieved at COP15 was extremely important, right? And I think it is extremely important that we now have some targets and goals that have been specifically set out. But what we still are missing and we need to focus on is that how we take this framework and break it down specifically so it becomes usable for the different institutions. Let me give you an example that we can relate to towards the financial sector and what we did from a climate perspective. The Paris Agreement came into force now 6-7 years ago in order to become net zero, in order to keep the 1.5 degree alive. The financial sector only in 2021 launched what's called the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which is basically financial institutions following a specific framework which is aligned to say that this is the steps you need to take in order to get to net zero. So now you have a framework that all the financial institutions can follow to say that these are the steps that are required to get to that point. I believe that something similar are required for specific sectors. So like we have the Net Zero Banking Alliance, you have the Net Zero Asset Owners Alliance, you have the Net Zero Insurance Alliance, and so on. You need similar alliances, directions specifically for biodiversity as well. you need to make sure, break it down. And I think it's great to see what CDP has done specifically to now include biodiversity in these specific things. I think that breaking down this to portions where the organization can specifically work with will make it practical and will make sure that we can achieve these specific targets and support on these, right? Because some of these targets are for 2030. We are in 23 right now. We don't have that much time to run on. We need to take specific actions. We need to make these frameworks very practical and solution oriented so we can have everybody to be able to embed it and implement it in their organizations.
Do you want to build on that, Dexter, from the perspective of your own disclosure system?
No, just to agree wholeheartedly with Shargil. I think you need the data, you need the information to underpin the decision making, particularly in the financial sector. You can't invest in what you don't measure, and that's a critical piece here. So what gets measured gets funded in many ways. And I think there's a lot of questions in the chat around the challenges around reporting burden. And I think that's absolutely fair enough. And I think one of the biggest challenges that we have is to build standardization and harmonization of these standards around the world to ensure that we're not asking different organizations to report on essentially the same information in slightly different ways. And the critical point, of course, from a buyer or an investor's perspective is they want to see standard. They want to compare apples with apples, right? So we want to be able to support organizations in what they're doing. We need to be flexible and more sensible on a sectoral basis and within regions, and that's really important. So the evolution of CDP's questionnaires will be more sectoral in their focus and more sensitive of the different challenges facing different types of organizations.
And I've seen also a question in the chat around the regional nature of ecosystems, that what works maybe in a certain country will not be so material in another country. So do we want to elaborate on this tension between having standards on one hand that can make companies comparable across the world and the diverse nature of nature?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the great initiatives that I've seen in recent years is actually the development of jurisdictional approaches. As we look at the deforestation issue in particular, you start to see the enormous symbiosis of biodiversity topics, water topics, but also the dependency on local communities and the capacity of organizations to really affect change. Because a lot of these things, a lot of the commodities that drive a lot of deforestation actually go through an incredibly complex series of traders around the world. So it's actually very hard to trace. So jurisdictional approaches, getting down and dirty locally, understanding the context of the action, and really working out how you create a sustainable jurisdiction from which you can buy from with confidence, and they are meeting the action that the type of actions that are required to become more sustainable. That for me is a very sensible way of addressing some of these topics. And I think certainly from a procurement angle, it really helps big buyers to support not just individual producers, but a whole ecosystem.
So Martin, to your knowledge, the national biodiversity strategies and action plans that are being prepared for the next COP in 2024, are countries that are sharing or nations that are sharing ecosystem, are they collaborating to their NBS apps plan? How is the work happening? Is it happening in isolation, nation by nation, or is there like a collective consultation going on?
It is both, to be honest. So there is an important collaboration around natural capital accounting for governments led by the United Nations Statistical department. They created the SIA framework, which stands for the System of Economic Environmental Accounting, that now includes natural capital account. And that is adopted by all countries around the globe and is implemented. Some regions, the European Union being very much in the forefront, I think are also supporting the interaction with business and business accounting for natural capital. So there are good examples, and the EU also says, yes, we are going to make this mandatory for the businesses in our region. So it is there. At the same time, there's also a clear request for capacity building, especially in the south, where companies lack the understanding at this moment, and they say quite clearly we need to build the capacity. Also, I would like to go back to one thing that Dexter said before: you don't finance what you don't get, what you don't measure. I think the reality is we do finance what we don't measure. So that's part of the problem. So yes, there are financial organizations that are financing energy plants in ecosystems where very shortly there will be a shortage of water, and then they really are in trouble. So the problem is that we should make more clear what are all the different elements. And one of the famous football players in the Netherlands, Johan Cruyff, some of you might know, he always had these great quotes. One of his quotes was, it's only clear to you when you see it, which is kind of amazing. But also here, this is what we have to face. Only when you start assessing your impacts and dependencies on nature, suddenly you see how important it is for you. So this is chicken and egg that we have to overcome. Back to you, Cedric.
Yeah, and I noticed the points made by Marina earlier, that nature's ecosystems are silent, invisible, and mobile. So really hard, effectively, to see and to tangibly understand. For that, there's questions maybe that I will direct to our friends in the UAE on the role of the education sector. There are lots of questions on the fact that, yeah, schools would like to get involved. Children would love to engage in all the efforts for biodiversity and nature positive future. So is there anything you'd like to share that is happening currently in the UAE or is planned to happen in the UAE that engages the school and the education sector?
Sure. I mean, I can comment on that and also maybe link to the discussion earlier. I mean, I think there's numerous initiatives that engage with schools, public volunteers. It's not only Emirates Nature WWF, there's numerous of NGOs in the ecosystem of the UAE, as well as EAD. We specifically, Emirates Nature WWF, also have a program which is called Leaders of Change. Happy to share the link as well with folks who are interested to participate. I believe we also launched very recently another initiative together with EAD on citizen science. So happy to share the resources. I think on the conundrum that we mentioned earlier, I mean, I think even on the climate change domain, nature is the same. I mean, if somebody thinks that nature, biodiversity protection and conservation is easier, I think I would say that they're not right. There is somebody posted on the chat I saw on coastal development. There is a tremendous competition for space on the coastal front line, not only in the UAE, around the world. Coastal zones are one of the most threatened areas around the world. I think from our side, what we're trying to do is to raise that awareness across all stakeholders. We want to, Shergil's point, focus a lot on the opportunities that come along with recognizing that those ecosystems have those economic benefits. Can we necessarily compare apples to apples with a real estate development that can generate, a huge income in a short term? No. And this is going back to that kind of time horizon that we plan our, developments as well. But nonetheless, we see an opportunity now with, the whole momentum happening in the UAE, that we can demonstrate how a different model can work, but also bring other examples from around the world, right? Stack up a lot of different projects on coastal communities and nature-based solutions, and see also what the role of private sector is. How can private sector come in and help those communities as well. So I'll stop here. I believe Shargil also had his hand up. I'm not sure, Shargil, if you wanted to comment on that.
No, thanks, Marina. No, I just wanted to take the discussion around the education a little bit further, because one of the things we often don't recognize plays the biggest role here is talent. The human capital and talent has a huge role to play if we are to unlock the potential within nature, biodiversity, and address the challenges we face with climate, but also nature. And this is highly underestimated how big a part this plays. We see a lot of different discussions around products. We see discussions around investments and policies, but we need to move the discussion also to capacity building, as it was mentioned, but also to get the talents, right? And this is extremely important. One way is to go through the education system, but it is also upskilling. We need to upskill our employees and our colleagues to specifically get bigger and play a bigger role within the climate change discussion, within the nature positive discussion is so critical. Otherwise, we will lose out on this huge opportunity we have, both from climate change perspective, but also from the biodiversity and nature perspective, which we need to address.
Thank you, Shargil. Maybe a question for Carlos on this tension that maybe exists between the commitments to fight the climate crisis and these new targets, these new goals around biodiversity. And I wonder whether the solution or the nexus, as we were talking about, the bridge, doesn't lie in our energy supply. Is there some innovations or some new thinking on energy that can help achieve both objectives that you'd like to share with us, Carlos? So what's your perspective on that?
Thanks. I think that we need to make sure that we assess projects on a case-by-case basis, and that we are able to develop renewable energy projects, maximizing the production of clean energy while at the same time really avoiding impacts on biodiversity, right? We have several very interesting examples at Masdar of how we deploy innovative technology solutions, solutions that are well proven in mature economies like the US or Europe, and we bring them to the Middle East or to Central Asia to minimize impacts on biodiversity. For example, we are now building a large wind farm in Uzbekistan, and we are deploying a shutdown on demand system that is the first time that is deployed in Asia, right? So for solar and wind projects, if developers are willing to do a serious assessment of biodiversity risks and invest and change their designs to mitigate impacts and in some cases offset impacts, we can make sure that there is a win-win solution.
Great. Marina, you want to say something on this topic?
Yes, I'd just like to build actually on the reverse topic as well, that a lot of, we recognize nature-based solutions obviously plays a key role. This has also been a bit of a hype of a term used in multiple ways. And we've also seen a lot of efforts for, carbon offsetting based on nature in multiple parts of the world that actually doesn't have a positive impact on nature, let alone also communities. So I think there is an important role of making sure that, first offsets are part of the mitigation hierarchy that companies need to take into account. This is the last, action that companies need to take, not the first, but also, planting or afforestation or this type of initiatives need to be very carefully designed to make sure that they deliver the impact that they're promising, right? Somebody posted as well on accountability. So these are important as well elements for companies as well to take into consideration.
Great, and I'm conscious of time, so we'll try to close this panel. Thank you very much for all your great questions, and thank you obviously to our panelists for answering them and giving their perspective. What I'd like to maybe highlight from this conversation is we seem to have identified where the bridge can be between the demands of nature and the demands of our economy and society. And using Shargil's terms, it's the human capital. So if we are true to the capitals approach of the capitals coalition, then maybe that was the missing link here. We need education, we need innovation, we need more knowledge, and we need to continuously learn and clarify what are the ecosystem services that we are benefiting from. For this, data seems to be also really rich and really important. That's a resource that for the moment we are not depleting. As a society, we could do more to make use of it, learn from all these assessments we're making on our supply chains to identify the hotspots and be clear as to how we want to innovate and find new ways of creating our economic or sustainable economic growth. I think we mentioned also the importance of trust and partnerships and relationships between different players. There's a strong belief that business is part of the solution, but business alone will not necessarily have all the cards in their hands and not all have all the information they need to make a solution. The supply chain approach, which seems to be working for net zero, maybe is also to be welcome. So we may find it hard as a humanity to reverse the course of nature. It's too complex for us to achieve that. But one thing we do well, we know how to build and adapt societies. So let's waste no time. Let's all work together now to transform our societies for a more positive relationship with nature. That said, I'd like to again thank you all for your questions and for our panelists, Carlos, Martin, Dexter, Marina, and Shargil. And I'd like to ask Huda to share our closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, Cedric, for great moderation of this session and for sharing the key highlights. And in behalf of Abu Dhabi Sustainability Group, I would like to send our gratitude, thanks to the speakers, Martin, Carlos, Shargil, Marina, Dexter, and you, Cedric, as well as I would like to thank our partner, Sustainability to Action, who supporting us on coordinating and bringing this, delivering this very informative Hiwar session. And at the end, I would like to thank our host, Masdar, ADSW Live Web Series, to brought this session, and it is a year-round initiative for continuing dialogue on issues and topics that are shaping the global sustainabilities. Our discussion will continue, and thank you a lot for your time. Thank you.